Ronli's body was laying face down on the floor in front of the couch in the living room area. She was wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt. Her face was covered with some cloth, and she was partially nude. There was a theory that she was possibly sexually assaulted due to her being partially dressed. However, the autopsy examination found that she was not sexually assaulted. So we believe that being partially nude at that point in time occurred during a struggle prior to her death.
It was the night of April 14, 2004, and 24-year-old Ronli Ratliff was on her way to a quiet house on Day Huff Road, just outside of Mooresville, Indiana. The place was empty, belonging to her mom and stepdad, and she'd been staying there alone while her apartment was being worked on. Ronli had plans to go back to her own space the next day, and she was eager to sleep in her own bed again. But that night, in the dark hours of the early morning, an unknown person entered the house, and Ronli's life was tragically cut short. She never got the chance to see the morning light.
The fire was reported at about 6:30 a.m. by a neighbor who had came out to leave for work. He noticed that there was smoke coming from the residence. He alerted his wife to call 911. He then went to the residence and seen that there was a car in the driveway. He attempted to gain entry into the residence and awaken anyone that might be in there. He was unable to do so. He said that the door was extremely hot. By that point in time, the fire department was on their way.
Dan Downing, the captain of investigations for the Morgan County Sheriff's Office, had only just been promoted to detective when he was called to the scene. He'd been with the department since 1997, first as a crime scene investigator, and in early 2004, he stepped up to lead his first case. That case, on Day Huff Road, would change everything.
After the fire was extinguished, then they were doing a search of the residence and they located a body. It was just prior to 7 a.m., and I was contacted by my supervisor at the time, who informed me that there was a fire-related death in the northeastern portion of our county, and he requested that I respond to the scene. When I arrived, of course, there was a great deal of emergency activity going on. Once I made my way into the scene, it was very apparent to me that this was not a fire-related death, that this was a homicide. The evidence was particularly visible to me, but it also appeared that the fire had been set after the crime had occurred, probably in an effort to cover up the crime itself.
The charred body found at the scene was 24-year-old Ronli Ratliff. She'd grown up in Mooresville, a small, close-knit town of fewer than 10,000 people. Ronli had graduated from the local high school and continued to live and work in the same town she'd always known.
Mooresville, Indiana, basically is a community that is directly south of Indianapolis, Indiana. It's more or less a bedroom community. Most of the folks in Morgan County travel to Indianapolis for work. We averaged about 4 homicides a year during that time period, so our homicide rate was extremely low. We mostly had property crimes, and we also, of course, had some personal crimes, but homicides were not high ranking as far as our number that we had during that time period.
Once the house was marked as a crime scene, Detective Downing moved carefully, inspecting Ronli's body for any sign, any clue that could explain what had happened to her, or why someone would do this. He was looking for anything that might bring him closer to the truth.
Ronli's body was laying face down on the floor in front of the couch in the living room area. She was wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt. Her face was covered with some cloth, and she was partially nude. There was a theory that she was possibly sexually assaulted due to her being partially dressed. However, the autopsy examination found that she was not sexually assaulted. So we believe that being partially nude at that point in time occurred during a struggle prior to her death.
It wasn't long before Robert Allen, Ronli's stepdad, showed up at the scene. He and Ronli's mom, Sandy, had been living separately from the house for months, but Robert still owned it. He saw Ronli's car in the driveway, and when he identified her body, his world seemed to shatter. He told the investigators that she was the only one who should have been there that night.
The family would use the house occasionally on weekends to have get-togethers. They would use the lake behind the residence and things like that, but no one was actually staying there until Ronli moved in there while her apartment was being remodeled. She had only been there a couple weeks prior to her death, and this was actually supposed to be the last night that she stayed at this residence before returning back to her apartment in Mooresville.
The news of Ronli's death spread fast. It wasn't long before her Aunt Kim Sink heard the terrible news and rushed to the scene. Kim had been like a second mom to Ronli, and the loss hit her hard. The young woman she had loved and cared for was gone, and the grief was almost unbearable.
A friend of mine, she came and picked me up, and we went out there to the house. When they pulled her out, covered up like that, I was just destroyed. We were pretty close. I'd always had her growing up, spent a lot of time with her, and we went camping. I took them drive-ins and cookouts and spent the night. She had long hair, kind of a sandy blonde. She had pretty blue eyes and still had her big cheeks that she was born with. She's very pretty. When she smiles, you can't help but smile with her. She was a typical young lady. She wanted everything that everybody else had. She wanted love, and she wanted warmth, and she wanted trust. Ronli liked to laugh, but she did more crying than she did laughing.
Ronli's childhood wasn't easy. Her mom, Sandy, and stepdad, Robert, both battled drug addiction for years. Sandy's struggles took a toll on Ronli, leaving deep emotional scars on the sensitive young woman. The chaos at home made Ronli's life difficult. She often had to take on the role of caretaker instead of being cared for.
Ronli was more there for her mother than her mother was there for her, if that makes any sense. They had gotten arrested, Sandy, my sister, and her husband. And that was the first sign that I really had of all that drug use and stuff. And then I could tell from that point on, it was just horrific. I don't know all the extent. I know how bad my sister was. Her face looked horrible. She couldn't do anything. Sandy was rude and mean to Ronli. If she had anything to say to Ronli, it was usually not in the most positive way. He was always critical of Ronli, but Ronli, she just bared through it. Her mom was basically the big issue towards the end of her life. That was pretty much all she thought about for several years, was just trying to get her mom back. All she wanted was her mom better.
Ronli kept a diary for much of her life. It was her secret world, tucked away in the attic of the house where she would later be found. For investigators, her diaries offered a glimpse into her inner thoughts, the struggles, the fears, and the heartbreak she faced growing up in a world overshadowed by addiction.
We were able to basically create victimology for Ronli and retrace her history as she wrote in her diaries telling about her life. She talked in depth about her struggles and her concerns about her younger sister and the rest of her family, and her concerns about her mom's drug use and the drug use in and around the body shop.
At the time of her death, Ronli's stepfather, Robert, ran Allen's Body Shop, a local towing and collision business. He'd inherited it from his father, but by 2004, the once thriving shop was barely hanging on. It had become a hotspot for illegal activity, especially drugs. The business, once the lifeblood of the family, had become entangled in the darker side of Mooresville.
We do have information and evidence that there were individuals in the body shop and around the body shop that were dealing in drugs at that point in time, and that there was a lot of drug activity that was going on at the family body shop. The drug activity was a big part of this business and how it was staying afloat, even though it was barely afloat. The environment at the body shop was one that Ronli disagreed with. Ronli's mom and stepfather were struggling with drug addictions, as well as most of the employees that were in and around the body shop at that point in time. She struggled to get her mom away from that type of environment. Ronli also had a younger sister who she was greatly concerned about because her sister was in the care of her mother and stepfather. So she spent a lot of time at the body shop trying to keep her mother out of the drug environment as well as protect her sister from the surroundings and hoping that she wouldn't get involved in the same aspects that her mother and stepfather had been involved in.
For Ronli, her family always came first, especially her mom and younger sister. Her love and devotion to them shaped every part of her life. But this dedication, as much as it showed her heart, also steered her down a path that left her constantly caught between her family's struggles and her own desires for a different life.
After she graduated, her and her best friend, Reese, was planning on going to college together. Unfortunately, Ronli's mother spent most of the money that Ronli would have had for college. So Ronli didn't get the chance to go to school like she wanted to. She was working at the body shop. She had previously worked at banks, worked as a phone answer at Blair magazine. She worked at a bar a little bit. Just different things. She's just trying to get out there and find herself. And at 24, she was starting to get into her confidence, which was something she never really had. She just was too worried about her mom. I mean, she was just worried about Sandy all the time.
Investigators knew that solving the mystery of Ronli's murder was going to be tough. They searched the crime scene for any shred of evidence that could point them in the right direction. They combed through the house, hoping to find something, anything that could help them unravel the reasons behind this senseless tragedy.
We basically took every item of evidence that was in conjunction with Ronli's body, the rug that she was lying on, her clothing. We also took other items that could help identify people that were at the residence prior to the murder. So we took all of the cigarette butts that were located in an ashtray next to her body. We also took beer cans and other items that could have been used for potential DNA in the future.
Detective Downing knew that the key to solving Ronli's murder was figuring out what happened in the hours leading up to it. So he sat down with her friends, family, and even some of the workers from the body shop. He was trying to piece together any unusual detail, anything that might give him a clue about what happened the night she was last seen alive.
She was actually at the body shop in the evening hours prior to her death. She had been there working and communicating with some friends of hers via AOL Messenger. Ronli told her mother that she was going to go home, and she wanted to practice her brush strokes for her art class that she had recently started. So we know that she left the body shop about 9 to 9:30 p.m. on the evening before her death. She did go home. She spoke to some friends while at home. We did not find any phone calls that evening after she left the body shop. And then after that, we don't know anything about what Ronli was doing at the home.
Only a handful of people knew Ronli was staying at the house: her family, a few of the body shop workers, and a couple of close friends. No one in the neighborhood reported anything strange that night, and there were no cameras to give the investigators any footage. So Detective Downing had no choice but to work with what he had, the evidence from the crime scene, to build a theory on what might have led to her murder.
Evidence shows that the killer or killers entered the back door of the residence. It was apparently known to the family as well as co-workers and friends of the family that the back door was normally left unlocked. And it did appear that this door was unlocked at the time that Ronli was killed. It was definitely apparent that there had been a struggle in the residence. There were several items inside that were knocked over. We found a clock that had been knocked over at approximately 3:30 a.m., we believe during an altercation. When that clock was knocked over and it struck the floor, the battery came out of the clock. That clock, of course, stopped at 3:30, so therefore we believe that the altercation began or was going on at 3:30 in the morning of the date of her death. It was later determined that the fire was set with an accelerant that was used in outdoor candles, which leaves pour patterns behind, which is completely different than a natural fire would occur from an electrical outlet or something like that. The fire was in the middle of the room and did not have any other ignition sources that could have potentially accidentally set that fire. It's not an uncommon practice for killers to set a fire after they have committed a homicide. It actually, most of the time, destroys a lot of evidence. It also conceals a lot of times the cause of death. In this particular case, it was completely unsuccessful because the fire did not continue to burn. It basically smoldered for quite some time.
To stir up some new leads, investigators took to the local news, hoping the public could help. They set up an anonymous tip line, and soon enough, they had a flood of information. But despite the many tips that came in, none of them led anywhere. None of them brought them closer to finding Ronli's killer.
Of course, early on, we had lots of tips that came in. Some of those tips were good. A lot of them were just people that had theories on the death. Most of those theories were not even close to being accurate. We also had people that were giving tips implicating family members of theirs for whatever reason. We had other people that were providing tips because they had purchased narcotics from a dealer who made a statement that you don't want to end up like the girl did out by Mooresville. So why people say those things, I don't know, but we've had numerous tips that have been false and misleading.
The Morgan County Sheriff's Office made a strategic move by withholding the cause and manner of Ronli's death. This was to keep the details from leaking to the public and to help eliminate false tips. The only people who knew exactly how Ronli died were the investigators and, of course, the killer. But why was she murdered? The house she was staying in had ties to the local drug scene. Was Ronli simply in the wrong place at the wrong time?
The area that Ronli's family owned, the house, basically at this point in time, was in an area that was relatively safe, and it wasn't uncommon for houses in Morgan County for folks to leave their doors unlocked when they slept at night. It was not a high crime activity area. If someone had came to the residence with the intent to burglarize or to steal property from the residence, knowing or even not knowing that the back door was unlocked, it was pretty simple for them to gain entry into the residence at that point in time. One theory could be that this was a crime of opportunity and that someone came to the residence either for drugs or for property that was kept inside the residence in an attempt to burglarize and stumbled upon Ronli sleeping on the couch. And the identity of that person or persons was known by Ronli, and therefore they had to silence her so that they did not get in trouble in the future.
Could it have been a robbery gone wrong? Nothing was reported missing from the house, but the property's connection to drugs meant that investigators couldn't rule out the possibility. Detective Downing didn't believe that the killer came to the house with murder in mind, though. He suspected that something else had gone terribly wrong that night.
Evidence shows that the person or persons that killed Ronli Ratliff knew her, and that was the reason that her face was covered with the cloth material, so that she could not see them and they could not see her during the act that was occurring. I don't think that the evidence indicates that they came there with the intent to kill Ronli. The scene was not a very well organized scene, so it didn't appear that it was a premeditated or pre-planned murder, that it was a murder more or less of opportunity, or that the circumstances had gone too far and Ronli ended up dead. So therefore, I don't believe that there was an intent for someone to actually come there to kill Ronli specifically.
The accelerant used in the fire and other items involved in Ronli's death had been stored on the property, and that made Ronli's Aunt Kim suspicious. She couldn't shake the feeling that whoever did this must have been familiar with the house, maybe even been there before. How else could they have known where to find everything they needed?
Whoever did this had to know everything about that house and everything around that house, and in the garage that was disarray that you couldn't see anything. You had to know what you were doing if you went into that garage. So whoever did it knew everything about that property. All the neighbors around there knew of the situation that was going on at that house out there. Everybody knew.
Kim didn't think for a second that Ronli's murder was some random act of violence. Ronli had spent years trying to pull her mom out of the grips of addiction. And in that time, she came to know most of the people in the local drug scene, especially those who hung around the body shop. She'd even threatened to turn them all in to the police, something that probably didn't sit well with some of them.
Ronli had threatened him several times, and Ronli's not a cusser, but she did say, I'll turn every effing last one of you in. But that's how upset and disappointed that she would be. And I'd say every time that she would be upset like that and cussing at him, she'd be tears just rolling down her cheeks. So it was a combination of anger and hurt. Each time that she would say it, there'd be a different kind of group. Some of them the same people, but then others, coming in and out. So all of them basically knew it. And I think she told them all again she was turning them in, even though she knew it meant her mom also. And I think that's the main reason why she hadn't done anything. I tell her, Ronli, you got to be careful. Just stay away from them. And she was starting to do that. But then again, her mom always was in the forethought of her mind.
Ronli basically had came to the point where she was at wit's end and had no other recourse, and had made a comment to her friend that she was considering turning her mom in so that it would force her mom into some type of rehabilitation or help for her substance abuse.
Was it someone from the Mooresville drug scene who decided to silence Ronli before she could report them to the police? If that was the case, it would have been a strong motive for murder. Investigators began combing through the list of people connected to the body shop, searching for anyone who might have had a reason to hurt Ronli.
During our investigation, we have pinpointed persons of interest in this case. One person of interest was at the scene the morning that I arrived at Ronli's residence. That individual was a family friend and also an employee at the body shop. He stated that he had pulled into the driveway between the hours of 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. prior to Ronli's death being discovered. First initial story that he gave us was that he had been traveling from Mooresville and was going to a nearby residence, and he stopped at Ronli's residence to use the restroom beside the detached garage at the residence. He stated that when he pulled in, he did notice that Ronli's car was at the residence. However, the residence was dark and there was nothing unusual going on at that point. He was basically trying to help us establish a timeline that there was no smoke coming from the residence and there were no other cars there between 3:30 and 5 when he got there. However, he implicated himself in being at the crime scene prior to her being discovered. His story then later changed that he had pulled in there to separate some drugs that he had recently purchased and that he didn't want to take all of the drugs that he had on his person into the residence that he was going to visit. Over the years, his story has changed, and he has given us 3 different stories for his activity on that evening.
Could the family friend who showed up at the crime scene have had something to do with Ronli's murder? His shifting stories about why he was there raised a lot of suspicion, but despite the inconsistencies in his account, he maintained that he saw nothing unusual that night, and investigators didn't have any DNA evidence that would link him to the crime.
This individual was at that point in time and is still today considered a person of interest. His DNA was found inside the residence. He's cooperated. He's given us his DNA. It does match other items in the home, which of course had a right to be there. He was there. He was a friend. He had visited the home before, but it doesn't match the particular items of DNA that were found on her body. So the people of interest that we have, and they have given DNA, it doesn't match those 2 particular points of interest that we're looking for.
With no hard evidence to tie their suspects to the crime, investigators were left trying to piece things together with tips from the community. But in a small town like Mooresville, people often have their own reasons for staying silent, even when they know something that could help solve a case.
Early on, it was pretty difficult to get people to talk to us about Ronli's murder, basically because a lot of them had drug involvement. They were concerned about themselves getting into trouble for their drug use and or involvement with the body shop and or people surrounding it. We also had some issues where people were afraid of individuals that had been employed at the body shop and afraid of any type of retribution that may come from them talking. It's been several years that have passed, and my hope is that some of these people have got out of the drug world and are dealing with this burden on their conscience that they have information, and that they'll come forward and basically say that, this is what I know. And or if they were scared about it at that point in time, these folks are a lot older now than they were at the point in time of Ronli's death. So I think their fear should be minimized at this point as far as any repercussions that come upon them.
Even though Ronli's mother and stepfather were central figures in the local drug scene, they'd yet to offer any real help in solving her murder. Whether it was because they didn't know anything or because they didn't want to get involved, it was unclear. What was obvious, though, was that their silence was frustrating everyone involved in the investigation.
I believe they know. If Sandy doesn't know for sure, I know she's highly suspicious of somebody. But then again, she doesn't want to be in the middle of it anyway. I mean, basically, the whole town, they don't want to get involved, and I never understood that. I still don't understand it. It still makes me so mad every time I think about it. But the whole town's that way. Everybody in Mooresville is connected.
Ronli's mother and father have been relatively cooperative over the years. It doesn't appear that they're involved in drugs anymore. It is possible that they have more information in regards to who is responsible for Ronli's death than what came forward at this point. However, only time will tell whether or not that burden is going to bring them forward with that information.
By 2014, Detective Downing had been working on Ronli's case for a decade. He had tried everything he could think of, but there was still no breakthrough. Desperate to breathe new life into the investigation, he pushed for the creation of a cold case unit, staffed with retired volunteer detectives. Their first case? To revisit Ronli Ratliff's murder.
They have re-interviewed the majority of everyone that had been initially interviewed in this particular investigation. They've also established new people with information that they've also been able to interview. They have submitted probably close to 100 new items of evidence for advanced DNA. They've also had the ability to send the hard drives from the computers that were seized from the crime scene back for a refresher analysis with updated software and things that weren't available in 2004.
The cold case unit brought in fresh eyes and new technology. They re-interviewed witnesses, submitted new evidence for DNA testing, and even sent old computer hard drives back for further analysis using more advanced software. With this new approach and the hope of uncovering fresh leads, investigators began to believe they might finally catch a break and uncover the truth.
This was my first homicide. This is the only homicide that I have that's unsolved. There's been thousands upon thousands of hours that were put into this case. From the first day of the homicide, myself and my mentor worked this case for 8 months straight, 6 to 7 days a week, until the case finally became so cold that there was nothing else for us to follow up on. After 26 years in law enforcement, this has become a part of my life. And I did the same with Ronli that I've done with every homicide victim, and I promised them justice. And I did that the morning in 2004. And I want to be able to carry that out. Ronli's family deserves answers. Ronli deserves justice. And we will not stop, and this case will not be closed until Ronli has that justice she deserves.
Nobody deserves what they did to Ronli. And I do think about it all the time, what she must have been thinking, what she might have been seeing, and what she might have been begging for. And it hurts me to know that she hurt like that. What keeps me going is I see Ronli's face, and I see her smile, and I see her say, "Aunt Kimmy," every moment of every day. And I refuse to let Ronli die in vain. Ronli was very much loved. She was very loved, and she's missed. I miss her. I think about her all the time. I miss her so much.